The Detroit Lions coaching staff, as we know, has been getting absolutely poached this offseason. But people tend to forget that this is Dan Campbell's one of his biggest strengths, his ability to put together a fantastic coaching staff. He's done this since he's gotten here. We forget that in 2021 he did take over play calling, or the Aubrey Pleasant situation during the year that had a great resume, but during the year the Detroit Lions moved off Aubrey Pleasant, and the defensive back room got better. This is what Dan Campbell has done. And today the Detroit Lions have announced their next offensive assistant, Bruce Gradkowski. So let's get right into it. So Bruce Gradkowski has been hired as the Lions' next offensive assistant, another former player, played at the NFL level as a quarterback for multiple seasons, most recently back in the coaching ranks as a high school coach and then quickly into an offensive coordinator at the UFL level. Another former player here that began his career at Tampa Bay in 2006. He was a 6th-round pick from the Toledo Rockets that had a fantastic career with Toledo. 2006 had kind of a rough finish as he was benched in a couple of games against Atlanta and Chicago, but he was brought back in 2007. We saw him a very little bit against Washington, 13 completions, 24 attempts. And that's when he landed with the Cleveland Browns. And with the Cleveland Browns, he was there for a single season in 2008. And in that single season, we saw him at the very end of the season. He was added in 2008, the final game of the season, completing 33% of his passes, 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Let's just say it didn't go extremely well. But it was 2009 with the Oakland Raiders where things looked like it may be the kind of break Bruce would be looking for, as he replaced Jamarcus Russell in 2009, went 2-2 that season with 6 touchdowns to 3 interceptions, completing about 55% of his passes, which was the highest of his career to that point. But unfortunately, this is where the injury bug started to take place for Bruce. He had torn MCLs in both knees that season. Then he returns for 2010. In 2010, he ends up separating his throwing shoulder. That year, he was completing 53% of his passes, 5 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and that's when Cincinnati ended up giving Bruce a 2-year deal. Now, over the rest of his career, we didn't really see much of Bruce, and again, this is where injuries kind of took over. 2 seasons with Cincinnati, and he ended his career with Pittsburgh. We ended up signing a 3-year contract with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but we rarely saw Bruce whatsoever, as he was mainly just kind of a special teams piece. He was a holder. We rarely saw Bruce play. He didn't even touch the field in his first 2 seasons. He got back into the football level at the coaching ranks, and that started at the high school level, which is pretty awesome because it's very local here, starting at Anthony Wayne as a volunteer quarterback coach, having all of that experience, and then landing the head coaching job, starting as the interim head coach, but being named the permanent head coach, though it didn't last incredibly long because in 2022, Rockets came back around and said, hey, let's add you as our offensive analyst. But he did spend 1 season fully with St. Francis de Sales, which is local. And I look at a lot of teams that they beat that season. There's a lot of teams that we had played this past season.
Fun. I mean, honestly, I was driving over to the start of training camp, and I was like, man, I'm kind of excited. I'm nervous.
So, for example, he ended up beating that year Clay, who we saw in the playoffs. He beat Start that year, who's in our conference, as well as Lima Senior and Clyde that season. They went 4-8 that year. They were ranked just outside of the top 150 in state rank, which is not fantastic, but it's pretty good considering that this couple of seasons without Bruce, they kind of fell apart. And I can tell you that coaching matters a ton at the high school level. It's about bringing everybody together, not just one side of the football. So you have to bring this entire group together. You have to build a culture. And of course, there's a lot of, hey, off the field, being able to bring everything together as well. And it seems like Bruce did a pretty solid job of that, but quickly he was poached from the high school level at St. Francis, which I just think is pretty darn awesome that he was a high school coach at St. Francis just a few years ago, and now all of a sudden he's working with the Detroit Lions. I think that's amazing. But from there, he lands as a Toledo offensive analyst, which again is where he played as a quarterback, and quickly St. Louis, the Battlehawks, stepped in from the UFL and said, nope, you're going to be our offensive coordinator. And he was the play caller from the booth, and we know we get the sound bites because live during those UFL games, they check in on the offensive coordinator.
Damp left, lead hot. Damp left, lead hot.
Basically, he did a fantastic job there. I mean, in their 2 seasons, they went 7-3. They ended up winning the conference one of those 2 years. They lost in the semifinals. They finished 3rd another season. A.J. McCarron, who was their quarterback at the time, had 2 fantastic seasons, statistically speaking, with the St. Louis Battlehawks. I mean, in his first season, he ended up completing about 69% of his passes, which is tremendous. 24 touchdowns to only 6 interceptions, as well as a 108 pass rating at over 2,100 yards in that 7-3 season. The next season, while the numbers took a little bit of a step back, they were still great. 15 touchdowns to 4 picks, completed 64% of his passes, missed a little bit of time that season to put nearly a 95 passer rating together at over 1,500 yards passing. So there was team success and there was A.J. McCarron success. But there's also the aspect that was a pretty heavy run team from what I could take away from the couple of games that I went through, because I wanted to dive in and just kind of see what that Battlehawks offense looked like and why maybe the Lions would be interested in bringing him in as their offensive assistant. I mean, you consider that this team in 2023 was averaging just under 25 points per game, and the next season that saw an uptick to about 260 points on the entire season, so that would put you at 26 points per game. This last season, it was rare that they went under 20 points scoring. I mean, they had one game that was about 12 points and a loss. They had another game and a win that ended their regular season at 53 points. A couple of things that really stood out to me from the Lions that made them so unique and so successful over the past couple of years that I'm very excited about, that it feels like he's going to be bringing to the Detroit Lions. So for example, they were a pretty heavy run offense. Felt like everything kind of stemmed off that rushing attack, and while I felt like when I was first watching it, like, okay, maybe there's not enough play action or things attached to the run game to really set up what they have been trying to utilize this entire game. Though toward the end of the game, the play action started to get heavily implemented, and it was super effective because of the run game that they had set up the entire game through. And the big thing there was the run game versatility that was brought to the table. This wasn't a very basic rushing attack. There was a lot that was brought to the table. It was a pretty heavy zone rushing scheme, but there was a lot of creativity off of it. Their tight ends were incredibly involved. You got lead block plays, you got counter zone runs that were implemented, you got running backs leading the way, you got jumbo packages used offensively, which of course the Lions will dabble in from time to time. But I think the implementation of their tight ends in the run game, as well as the creativity in the package that they utilized, really stood out to me there with that zone rushing attack. Then you still get the gap scheme that would be thrown in, you get the power runs, you get the counters, as well as some sweep runs utilized as well. There was just a lot of versatility to the run game. Now, there was very little under center implemented from what I had noticed. There was a lot of pistol and shotgun usage, and if there was one thing that maybe I would have liked to see was more motion that was utilized within their run plays, but there was a ton of creativity and it was very successful. Getting into their passing attack, the big thing that stood out to me was really the play calling by down and distance, and I think this is what made the Lions so unique over the last few seasons with Ben Johnson. Is if it was third down and short, that didn't mean that they were absolutely going to run the ball. They tried to take a shot in that situation because they knew they'd go for it on fourth down, and obviously sometimes it doesn't work out. We saw in the playoff game, hey, it's a strip sack fumble, you end up leaving with no points, and Washington scores going the other direction when you have a chance to go up 2 touchdowns. But that being said, still the idea made a ton of sense, and as long as you can execute it, an opportunity to take advantage of what the defense is expecting and then being able to work off that. Let's get a shot play, let's get a fantastic matchup because it's third down and short and they're expecting a run, or they're playing aggressively upfield, and that's what they utilized, as we got to see with St. Louis a ton. Now, from the games that I went through, there wasn't as much execution there, and I think again that comes back to the players being able to execute that. Maybe that's a little bit of a concern with the coaching side of it. It was even things like, hey, it's a 2-point conversion from 5 yards out, we're going to run the football, or it's second and long, they're expecting pass, or dropping back a little bit, let's run a wide receiver screen and let them get to work after the catch. Those kind of down and distance situations really stood out to me. Then you get to the creativity that was clearly utilized, and again, sometimes it didn't completely execute, but it was absolutely there. Wide receiver passing in the red zone, 2-point tries when the field's condensed and you want to get creative to try to get somebody open, even things that went wrong. That was the kind of creativity that was clearly implemented. Within 2 games, it stood out. And I think the big part was the way that they manufactured explosive plays offensively. So I have a clip of looking back at what Bruce had said about what he basically looks for from the quarterback position, because during his time getting back into the coaching ranks at the high school level first, he was heavily involved in the social media world, kind of analyzing what he saw taking place. And for example, during the draft, we got to see that in 2020 he spoke on Jeff Okudah, but he also spoke on the quarterback position, how much he liked Joe Burrow, but specifically Tua Tagovailoa, and the fact that the Miami Dolphins were willing to draft him because it wasn't about as much of what the player maybe brought athletically speaking, but it was more so about the timing within the offense.
Dude, if you can have a stable guy, someone that brings that mentality to the locker room, it goes a long way. And that's why I'm a big fan at the quarterback position. It's not all about ability. It's about being that right leader, making the right decisions, your feet and timing and rhythm and just getting it done that way.
The rhythm that they would put together offensively and the decision making. And I think when you watch this kind of offense, while McCarron took off a ton, it wasn't that it was a ton of designed runs for the quarterbacks, more so the decision making. There was a clear emphasis on the way that we're going to read through the safeties and see how they adjust so that we can make our decisions to get the ball out of our hands quickly. So there was early shot plays that were taken, and even though sometimes they didn't execute, it was like, hey, we got our one-on-one, let's get the ball out of our hands quickly, let's get the ball out fast. And the shot plays that they were able to manufacture were through that creativity creativity offensively, like things, for example, we got fake screens that would turn into big shot plays down the sideline to really open something up. And then the thing that I loved about their passing game as a whole was the way that they set their concepts. For example, I didn't always think the quarterback maybe had his eyes in the right spot and they would leave things out there, which could be a little bit of a concern. We'll see how that plays out with the Lions. But in terms of just the true concepts that were set up with the receivers, I loved it. By zone coverage, there was seemingly a pretty quick reactiveness to, okay, they're in quarters, or now they're in cover 3. How are we going to beat that? They constantly would flood zone coverage. They constantly had short motion pre-snap and motion to kind of set up an opportunity to overflow one part of a zone coverage look defensively. The stacks that they were utilized to switch releases off the ball to get guys open. The way they would settle down players against zone coverage. I mean, you would get the deep in breakers, you'd get the clear outs where they would be more tight window throws, but there were definitely openings that they would create against zone coverage. And they found a way to constantly find answers there just by the route concepts that they would run alone and all of the pre-snap movement that would happen to create clear out opportunities, to create opportunities to overload one side of zone coverage, and at times maybe get a tell on where the defense was going to get to in zone coverage. But they weren't heavily reliant on that. They were more so reliant on the concepts that they could create post-snap. Quick passing on second and long into screens that would allow run after catch opportunities. But I love just the concepts that I got to see with Bruce and what he was implementing within that offense. And that's what really stood out to me. His takeaways is down and distance decision making, being aggressive on short yardage situations, expecting them to be aggressive defensively, and how can we take advantage of that because of what they're trying to do, and we get good matchups and we get single high safety looks, versus at the same time when they are playing deep and are expecting us to try to get those yards back, we're going to work underneath, we're going to pass the football. And then all of it still seemed to stem around what does the run game look like. There's a ton of versatility in how we're going to run the football. There's a lot of diversity within our run scheme, but it all is going to start with that run game, and we're not afraid to run it in a situation which feels like, oh, you have to throw it here. No, we'll run the football. That's fine with us. We're going to trust that. And ultimately they found a way to kind of implement the RPO game and ways to kind of really settle in off of the run game that they had set up all game long. So for me, I think stylistically this makes a ton of sense. I think as an offensive assistant, a guy that they can bounce ideas off of, it is fantastic because he fits kind of into the same tree that the Lions have had the last couple of years, is that aggressive nature situationally while also having a ton of creativity. And you think about losing a guy like JT Barrett to the Chicago Bears, which really stinks, who Ben Johnson credited for a lot of the creative and the creative plays that they would come up with. Like, for example, the fake fumble against the Chicago Bears was guys like JT Barrett and Seth Ryan, who, by the way, Seth Ryan is still here. Now for the Lions to bring in a guy with this kind of experience in different systems that had played the quarterback position, but also has done a fantastic job with quarterbacks that he's worked with and has shown that kind of creativity and the aggressive nature and really understanding down and distance and being able to get ahead of what the defense is getting into. I thought that was fantastic. If there was one concern, it was on third downs where, yes, we want to be aggressive, but at the same time, can we find easy answers for the quarterback? And I didn't always think that was always there. For example, goal line situations, they needed a yard. You did get to see the pick plays implemented, the expectation of man coverage. You got to see the RPO elements. So for me, I think this is a very, very intriguing hire by the Lions. I think it's awesome that just a few years ago, he's coaching right around the corner. I think this is a fantastic pickup for the Lions, and I'm excited to see what kind of help that he can bring to us, especially in some of the creativity that maybe we lost this offseason and bringing that back. So with that being said, Bruce Gradkowski is the Lions' new offensive assistant. I'm fired up for this hiring. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Brian, for watching, and I'm out.